Police officers of Reddit. What is your best "I think we have the wrong person" story? I've got two, from 25 years ago when I was a cop, one on one side of the badge and one from the other. The first, I got assigned a warrant service to pick up a wanted felon. Mr. Robertson was 6 feet tall, 250 pounds, long red hair, bushy red beard, and lived at, let's say, 123 Elm Street. Pretty distinctive dude. So I roll up to 123 Elm Street, and sure enough, there mowing his lawn in the front yard is the man himself. 6 feet, 250, red hair, red beard. I make contact with him. "Hey, Mr. Robertson, you got warrants and it's time to go to jail." Hook him up, take him to jail, and in central booking I get his property off him, and while filling out the inventory happen to notice this guy is Mr. Robinson, not Robertson. Sure enough, the wanted guy was my guy's landlord, and his twin brother from another mother doppelganger. When I'd said Robertson, Robinson didn't even twig to the fact I hadn't said his name. He just heard the similar sounding name as his own. We had to walk the whole thing back and reactivate the warrant, then kicked him loose with a handshake and an apology. The one from the other side, I had just gotten off duty at 2 a.m. and was driving home still in uniform. There wasn't any other traffic on the road, so I wasn't really surprised when a police car turned in behind me and started following me. I figured he was trolling for drunks and I was the only thing moving on the road, so he was just going to follow me a little to observe my driving, and he'd realize pretty quick I was sober and peel off. Instead, another patrol car joined him, and another, and another. Then all four lit me up, and spread out behind me, blocking the road in a full felony stop. Well, this just got interesting. They went through the whole procedure, and I carefully followed their instructions. When they finally got me out and saw my uniform, they just stopped for a few seconds while I was trying to figure out just what the hell was going on. Then 3 of the officers got in their cars, turned off their lights, and took off, while the original officer told me I could put my hands down and explained what was going on. My car was a spot-on match for the suspect vehicle in an armed robbery and shooting that had just occurred right up the road. I'd driven right by the scene before the cops even got there, a few minutes before the officer in the next district spotted me and thought I was the suspect. It was an interesting night. Not a cop but the wrong person in question. There is another man 2 years younger than me who shares my first and last name. Exact same spelling. The only difference is the middle name. Police were investigating a county trustee who was giving people housing assistance checks they didn't qualify for. They would cash the assistance and give the trustee a percentage back. One of the civilians being investigated was the other guy. A plainclothes cop in an unmarked car shows up with a female holding a clipboard, identifies himself as a state trooper, and within 5 minutes is asking me for copies of my bank records. He's threatening to subpoena if I don't comply. This isn't the first time I've been mistaken for him. I used to get his mail all the time, and I even asked if they were looking for me or the other guy, pointing out our different middle names. I got really suspicious really fast, a high-pressure situation, demanding access to my financial records, threats of subpoenas and further legal action, so I started to doubt this was an actual police officer and was in fact just a scammer. The badge he showed me was just a plastic square like my driver's license. Further muddying the issue, I told him I wanted to speak with the police and called dispatch. 2 uniformed officers showed up 15 minutes later and confirmed the guy was an officer. The woman with him was some kind of auditor and records keeper. After a further 15 minutes of questions, the woman pulled the guy away and pointed out something on her phone. Yep, they wanted the other guy. There had been a string of robberies, 7 in 2 weeks, in my neighborhood, so everyone was on high alert. I was home by myself, and one of my dogs started puking, so I rushed to let him outside, forgetting my dad had set the alarm. We had a silent alarm, so I had no clue it had been tripped, sending out a dispatch request to the local 520. 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. I'm young, home alone by myself, and had been told to never answer the door if I was alone, so I didn't. They kept knocking. Long story short, they broke the door down. They thought they had caught the burglars. Multiple cars. I vaguely remember there being a K9 unit involved, and the police had the suspect, a 9-year-old girl, crying her eyes out. I was not the group of thieves, who ended up being caught about a week later. Old neighbor accused me of stealing from his house and eating his food and stealing his dead wife's jewelry. He said I matched the build and clothing of the thief. Police came to our house and they knew my dad and were skeptical to me being a criminal. I do pass the guy's house when I walk home, but I didn't even know someone lived there. Neighbor was adamant when they showed my face to him and said his oldest grandson is going to stay with him so he could be safe. Grandson arrives and police notice he looks like me. The build and clothing especially. Yeah, turns out his grandson would come to sneak into his house and steal stuff to feed his drug habit. Two of my colleagues, murder squad detectives, attended custody to meet a defendant answering bail. When they arrived at the custody desk, there were a couple of people hanging around, waiting for the solicitors. They told the custody sergeant they were there for insert name, and he pointed one of the guys out. They went up and introduced themselves and said they would be questioning him at another station. So all three got in the car and headed off. Whilst driving, they told the defendant what would be happening. On arrival, he would be arrested on suspicion of attempted murder, questioned and either bailed or remanded. The guy was like, "You've got to be joking. Attempt murder? I was shoplifting." He was relatively calm, half laughing and shaking his head. A short time later, one of the officer got a call from the custody sergeant. Their actual bail appointment had arrived. There were two defendants with the same name answering bail that day. They apologized to the non-murderous shoplifter, turned the car around and headed back to bring the right person in for questioning. Keystone Cops to the max. I was 16 and worked at a golf course mowing lawns and such. We got a call at home from the cops that said I'm a suspect in a hit-and-run accident because my plates were on the car that drove away without stopping. The cops said the car was maroon-colored. My car was gray. We told them and figured that was that. The next day at work there was a minor accident. A dumbass coworker pulled a metal rake too hard and the rack holding it came down onto my forehead. It wasn't a deep wound, but it bled a lot. My boss took me to the ER to get my head super glued, and to be safe, took me home too. Thus my car stayed at the golf course. That evening a cop comes by and finds me with a head wound and my car is missing. I look quite guilty. By sheer luck, the cop calls someone after talking to my parents and discovers they got the guy and the plate numbers were close. I probably would have been arrested. I live in a small town in rural England, and we used to get some trainees, new police officers from the Met there for their training. Me and some of my friends were teenagers. We were walking to the supermarket, because what else is there to do in a small town pre-internet? Suddenly from out of nowhere this police car comes screaming out of nowhere, sirens going and screeches to a halt in front of us. A young guy, must have only been about 5 years or so older than us, jumps out and starts giving us the whole hairdryer treatment. He lines us up and starts taking our statements of what we had been up to in the last hour, gloating at us. "You lads are in trouble now. Criminal damage, trespass, theft. You have really screwed up." With him was the local Bobby, and he came up to each of us in turn after the younger guy had grilled us and said very jovially, "Now don't worry lads. I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. We've had some reports of a break-in. You don't match the preliminary description. And I'm sure we'll get this cleared up when we get the more detailed description come through." So the more detailed description comes through the radio and the young guy is wearing the biggest shit-eating grin you've ever seen. The description didn't even remotely match. And honestly, the young guy looked so disappointed we all ended up feeling sorry for him. So yeah, that was probably quite embarrassing for him. Well, like many other posts, I'm not a PO, but I did get felony stopped while on Las Vegas Boulevard. I left work, pulled out of the parking garage and turned right on Tropicana. I then see lights behind me and start to pull over thinking it was an emergency vehicle. I am then surrounded by police with guns drawn. This was like midnight on the strip, so it was intense. Police make get out, walk backwards with my hands on my head. They cuff me and tear into my car almost immediately. Long story short, it was another Mustang with out-of-state tags involved in a robbery. That was an intense evening. Not a police officer, but I was the wrong guy once. I was dating this girl, and when things didn't work out, She got vindictive. She had a copy of my car insurance and got a guy friend to pose as me to call the police and report my vehicle stolen. I go be bopping out of work one glorious Friday afternoon and get felony stopped by about 10 Dallas TXPD officers. Guns drawn on me and everything. Right outside of the large office complex I worked at. Turns out the people who reported my car stolen used their own phone number when filing the report and eventually got caught and charged.